All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson. I'd like to thank you for joining us for our SMA INSS PRISM speaker session entitled AI Will Change War. I'd also like to thank today's distinguished guests, General John R. Allen and Mr. Amir Husain, for taking the time to speak with us today. But before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's event. So during our speaker's brief or during the Q&A, please feel free to submit your questions through ZoomGov's chat function. It's a chat icon at the bottom bar of your screen. Also submit all of your questions today to Ms. Mariah Yeager. Her name should be listed as questions-Mariah Yeager, and questions that aren't submitted to Mariah specifically may not be addressed. So please make sure to send those questions to Mariah. Also note that your name is going to appear in the chat before your question, and it'll be read out loud before we address that question. If you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen, then more next to your name, and finally rename. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to today's moderator, Mr. Michael McLausick, who's a senior fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at NDU, and it's PRISM Journal's lead editor. So Mr. McLausick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us at this session of the NDU PRISM Speaker Series hosted by our partners at the Strategic Multilayer Assessment. This series of distinguished speakers seeks to tease out the most vexing emerging challenges to our national security, focusing this year specifically on great power competition, geoeconomics, and technological innovation. Over the past decade, there's been a great deal of commentary on the changing nature and/or the changing character of war. According to Clausewitz, war's nature doesn't change, only its character. Our main peer or near peer adversaries are betting heavily on artificial intelligence, AI, as a game changer. President Vladimir Putin of Russia says the nation that leads in AI will be the ruler of the world. And China aspires to be the world leader in AI. The prospect of artificial intelligence in warfare opens so many Pandora's boxes, it's hard to know where to start. Our two very distinguished speakers today are Mr. Amir Husain and General John Allen. Mr. Husain is an American artificial intelligence entrepreneur and the founder of the Austin-based company Spark Cognition and the author of the book, The Sentient Machine. He's also, I'm proud to say, an author in the current issue of PRISM, where his article is entitled, AI is Shaping the Future of War. General John Allen is former commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force and US forces in Afghanistan, and later special presidential envoy for the global coalition to counter the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL. They will speak for approximately 45 minutes, after which they'll respond to your questions and comments as you provide them in the Zoom chat space until we run out of time. With that, gentlemen, are you ready?
I think we're ready.
The mic is yours then.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. I think we're going to bring the slides up, and I'll make some brief introductory remarks and then go through a series of slides. We'll turn the floor over to Amir, and he'll take over the second half of the presentation. Well, first, let me thank you for the opportunity to join this distinguished audience today. This is an area, the idea of hyperwar, and this very provocative title for this presentation. This is an area that has been of great interest to Amir and to me in the last several years. And as you properly said, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes in my own presentation, there is the character of war, which is largely defined by the nature of technology at any given moment, but also the rate of change. And then there's the nature of war, which is the human dimension. And as we go forward in time, we will see in fact the potential blending of the character and the nature of war, which have, for so many scholars over the years, been strongly separated with quite a firewall, because there'll never be a change to the nature, and there'll never be a change to the character in the context of them coming together. But as we see cognitive systems and cognitive and autonomous systems more frequently and more widely used in conflict, we may well see a time when there is a blending between the character and the nature of war. And what that may do, as we see in the title, is move us towards a moment where the conflict spectrum the decision action loop begins to collapse to zero. Conflict in the age of zero lapse. Now, let me take a moment because I'm going to talk a lot about the nature of war, the human capacity to operate in an environment that could approach the reality of hyperwar. And Amir, of course, with his tremendous background in artificial intelligence and the technical dimension of this, the character of conflict, will pick up from where I leave off. And let me just make one quick comment about Michael in his presentation. He talked about Prism as a magazine, a professional journal. And I have to tell you, the last edition and almost every edition I've ever touched was really spectacular on this matter. Prism is a great contribution to our professional knowledge. They do a great job in editing that effort, and Amir just had a terrific article on this matter in the most recent Prism, which was a great edition itself. And I would strongly recommend that this audience have the opportunity. Please read that entire edition. So we know from time immemorial that for commanders in conflict, the decision-action relationship is essential. And those commanders who have the capacity to decide and act more quickly than their opponents, whether that is at a tactical level or truly at a strategic or a grand strategic level, those leaders at that level who can decide and act more quickly will often prevail in conflict, whether that's in close or at the strategic level or even in global considerations. And what we know is that according to a great Air Force observer of conflict, a fellow by the name of Colonel John Boyd, that it absolutely is required that for those who will be successful in conflict must have the opportunity to understand the dynamics of the intellectual process for decision making. So on the next slide, you'll see that he originated something called the OODA loop, or the observe, orient, decide, and act loop. If we can go to the next slide, please. Many of you have seen it or heard of it. It is far more complex than simply the graphic that you see. The whole idea of making a decision and ultimately acting on it is more complex than this. But when in the reality of the intellectual processes of commanders and leaders in conflict and in combat, we have to understand that this is a leadership issue in many ways, where the leader observes the environment, orients on the components of that environment, makes a decision with respect to the actions that will be taken, and then acts themselves. And this really is not a linear process. It's a circular process. And in fact, it's a spiral. And for those who can move more quickly and decisively through the OODA loop, there's a upward spiral, a virtuous spiral. And for those who are slow or who can't keep up with the actions of their opponents, it's a downward spiral. And so what we have tried to do, and what we will always try to do, to be successful in battle or in combat or in war, is to move more quickly through the OODA loop, ultimately causing the moral collapse of our opponent. That is the ultimate outcome. And this requires that commanders and leaders understand conflict. They must truly study this. It's a lifelong commitment. And so here is a perfect example, and I'll have a couple of case studies as I go through my few minutes here. At the end of World War I, when the German army was obviously defeated at the end of World War I, and with the advent of the Versailles Treaty, the German army was limited in its size, down to 100,000 and about 10,000 officers, with no heavy equipment per se. And it became very clear to the leadership at that point that what was going to be essential going forward was that in the absence of a robust character of war, in other words, in the absence of a robust technological dimension to the German army at that potential moment, the harvesting of the intellectual prowess of the officers was going to be absolutely essential. And so ultimately that individual who led that process in the German army, the post-World War I German army, was Hans von Seeckt. And this is an interesting quote. He talked about the essential thing being action. And ultimately, in that context, how action ultimately relies upon several personal characteristics: character, will, and intellect. And as we consider the future of conflict, and as we embrace the nature and the realities of technology coming forward, we have to instill in the leaders of our military the capacity to wield in the right combinations character, intellect, and will. And it's ultimately essential to the capacity to make decisions and ultimately to apply the technologies that are rapidly emerging today in the battle space and will dominate the battle space in many ways going forward. So next slide, please. So as this seemed to be the intellectual framework for moving forward in that interwar period, what we saw then and what we see now, hyperwar being the acceleration of conflict by virtue of the emergence of advanced and advancing technologies. What we see now as we think about this concept of hyperwar going forward is that the emergence of these technologies will have the net effect of massive disruption. We'll see that autonomy, we'll see that miniaturization, and we'll see that the capacity to rapidly deploy these capabilities will, in fact, in many respects, undermine traditional thinking about the entire character of war. And we'll also see that as we move into this age of hyper conflict, that the idea of speed becomes essential. Conflict will become vastly accelerated in an environment where autonomy, where autonomous systems, where automated decision support and decision support systems will ultimately provide the basis for commanders to think, decide, and act more quickly than ever before. We will see that the OODA loop will start to move towards a zero time phase. And then very importantly, the nature of this technology as it goes forward, intelligent systems, cognitive systems, will give us the capabilities to move more quickly than our opponent, to decide and act, and the decisions will be assisted and supported, and the actions will be assisted and supported in ways we could not have imagined before. And this is visible. This is discernible in the future. We are not in a hyperwar environment yet, but what we're seeing is that components of the human interaction with technology today and the actions of our own Department of Defense and the actions of the ministries of defense around the world, in particular our principal peer competitors, the Chinese and to a lesser extent the Russians, they're investing very, very heavily in these kinds of technologies in order to accelerate conflict beyond our capacity to keep up with them. So the hyperwar environment, how will it be characterized? We'll see a pervasive appearance of artificial intelligence, which will in fact power the automated dimensions of decision support, intelligence collection, analysis, and dissemination, and will support autonomy within weapons. And it's very important that this audience and rights and the rule of law, we are not yet fully agreed on the role of lethal autonomous weapon systems in the battle space. And this is a major area for debate, and we can talk about this in the questions and answer session. But I will tell you that I don't think our opponents have any doubt about where autonomous weapon systems will play in the battle space in the future for them. So the future of drone technology, autonomous drone technology for both reconnaissance and intelligence collection, drone technology to assist cognitive networks for command and control, but also importantly, drone technology that could be used to deliver lethal effects or destructive effects against critical infrastructure. All of that, I think, is on the table going forward. And how we progress in this area as a people will be in many respects defined by the values that we ultimately impart. And then, of course, we seldom talk about biotechnology and the potential for biotechnology to change war dramatically, both in terms of health sciences, medical facilities, medical support in the battle space. But as we move forward with brain-computer interface and human-machine interaction, we will see that biotechnology will begin to play a very important role in the battle space as well. And as I said, we see and we can envisage new dynamics, automated and autonomous adaptation, the cognitive system that sees a change in the environment and adapts the system or the network specifically because of that change, far faster than we might have been able to first detect it ourselves and ultimately to adapt ourselves. And this can not only be reflected in our capacity for adaptation, it will certainly be reflected in our capacity to decide and act. And remember, what I said is the decision-action relationship, the speed with which one can be taken and the other can be executed, has always been at the heart of that side which can often prevail in the battle space from time immemorial. And this is going to be a capacity through artificial intelligence, automated systems, and autonomous systems to accelerate that dramatically. And of course, in the context of the application of lethal effects, we could see that this will also have a dramatic effect in terms of target acquisition, target identification, target engagement, and ultimately target re-engagement as necessary. Slide, please. So as Michael said at the beginning, properly said, there's a ancient, if you will, Clausewitzian relationship between the human dimension of war, or the nature of war, and the technological dimension of war, the character of war. And what we know is that this relationship exists today. And Clausewitz was so prescient when he would formulate this theory of the relations between the human being and the technology applied in conflict. But these two are always in tension. Does the human in the equation, does the human fully understand the technologies that are available or the technologies that are emerging? Does the human understand not only the potential capacities for those technologies to contribute ultimately to success and prevailing in the battle space, but does the human dimension understand the potential for technological change? And what we have discovered over time is that when that relationship between the nature of conflict and the character of conflict in a particular country or in a particular military gets out of equilibrium, then there's a real potential for strategic surprise. So as leaders, and I recently had the great honor of participating in a Navy commission to look at the education of naval officers and senior leaders within the naval service, where this very conversation was had. Have we as a naval service, have we fully understood and fully judged not just the nature of technology today, but the changing nature of technology, and embraced it in the manner that gives us the capacity to wield that technology and to operationalize the potential for the change in technology going forward, to try to achieve the equilibrium necessary, first to prevail, and second to prevent strategic surprise. And we've seen this. History has shown this over and over again. And I won't spend a lot of time with each one of these particular examples, but it's important to understand that in the Civil War, the rifled musket was not understood by Civil War leadership. And as a result, the changes in the tactical application of force in the Civil War ultimately was devastating because the massed formations that had been appropriate for the smoothbore musket did not open up with the realities that a rifled musket gave you much longer range, much higher volumes of fire, and much greater accuracy. And so those closed shoulder-to-shoulder formations that had been appropriate for the Brown Bess smoothbore musket didn't really change. And the casualties in the Civil War were devastating just because of that one technological advance that was not understood by the human component, the nature of the conflict. We saw it again in the Prussian campaigns in the latter part of the 19th century, where the preparation of the railroad system was intended to rapidly be able to move large numbers of forces, Prussian forces, throughout the theater, which gave them a relative advantage in speed. It accelerated their capacity to act in the battle space and across long distances far more quickly than their opponents could. Another example was the rapid firing artillery and the machine guns that we saw in World War I. And I don't need to spend a lot of time on the history there, where the leaders on both sides, but primarily on the side of the Germans and the French and the Americans, failed to understand what the Maxim machine gun did to fundamentally change the nature of the battlefield. And the frontal assaults across no man's land created hideous numbers of casualties and wounded throughout that conflict. 20 million dead in the First World War, and so much of it because of an incapacity of the human component of the character and nature of war to embrace the change that this technology brought to the battlefield and to properly apply force that both reduced vulnerability and took maximum advantage of these capabilities going forward. And then, of course, the Blitzkrieg is one of the most prominent examples of how the integration of technology, existing technologies, created a capacity for leaders who understood what speed and the capacity to penetrate an opponent's linear defenses gave ultimately, not just in wielding the military capabilities, not just the technical capabilities, but ultimately gave the military leadership that was wielding lightning war or the Blitzkrieg, gave it the capacity to collapse the moral development or the moral capabilities of the leadership on the other side. And it was a dramatic change, and it was why there was such success on the side of the German forces early along, until leaders who understood the nature and the relationship of technology ultimately gravitated to levels of prominence on the Allied side. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor was one of the great examples, and sadly, one of those moments in American history where we were badly out of equilibrium, where those leaders within the United States Navy who had grown up in the battleship line didn't really understand and hadn't embraced the reality of marrying naval aviation with aircraft carriers. And as a direct result of that, we found ourselves on the 7th of December, just 80 years ago, last week, 7th of December, badly beaten by a naval service that had, in fact, understood the innovation of technology, of aviation married with aircraft carriers, and what they did to the United States Pacific Fleet was a direct result of the human dimension or the nature of war not keeping up with the technical dimension going forward. But what about the future? What does autonomy bring to the battlefield? What does artificial intelligence bring to the battlefield? And are we intellectually ready? Do we fully understand what this technology is today, how it will change in the future, and how that technology fits into the larger capacity to wield the characteristics of war as we command our forces going forward? And we have seen leaders who were intellectuals throughout our history. And going back to the example of the Blitzkrieg, here are just four who fully understood the nature of the human dimension of war, or the nature of war, and the technological advantages that were now available through rapidly moving, fast-moving armored vehicles, wireless radio communications, and artillery, flying artillery, the Stuka, being able to create a synergy of those three systems that ultimately caused the one side to accelerate its capacity for wielding this conflict, this capability in this conflict, far quicker than the other. And because they were able to move so quickly, the other side was unable to keep up. The French leadership, the British leadership were largely incapable of keeping up with the velocity and the acceleration of these forces. Because, as to go back to my slide early in the presentation, because the German army at that particular moment had institutionalized the intellectual capacity to understand the nature and the relationship to the character of war, and how by institutionalizing it, they could compress the components of the OODA loop, which ultimately brought about the moral collapse of our opponents. Not because we destroyed more or killed more, destroyed more of their equipment or killed more of their troops, but because the moral collapse came from an incapacity to keep up. The one side was in a downward spiral within its OODA loop, while the other side was in an upward virtuous spiral because it could move faster. And that was institutionalized. And this is something we have to be thinking about. How do we prepare our leadership intellectually for the realities of rapidly changing technology, to see it, to embrace it, and to operationalize it? Slide, please. So here's the example of Pearl Harbor. It's worth studying Andrew Cunningham because as a British admiral, he'd had extensive experience early in his career at sea. He was a student of the profession of arms. He fully understood the relationship of how carrier aviation could revolutionize the capacity of one Navy to deal with a primarily surface-related dreadnought-style Navy. And he was tasked ultimately with dealing with the Italian fleet in the Mediterranean in order to prevent the Italian fleet from interdicting the capacity of the British to support the British forces in North Africa. And he put his flag in the HMS Illustrious, and using the biplane, the old Swordfish, it was an old airplane at that particular moment in the British Navy, using the Swordfish biplanes, flying off the Illustrious, an aircraft carrier, carrying torpedoes, attacked the Italian fleet in 1940 at the Battle of Taranto, and inflicted significant damage on that fleet. Now, interestingly, the Japanese naval attaché in Berlin very quickly made his way to Taranto to fully understand how naval carrier aviation had the capacity of dealing with this surface fleet. And we should not be surprised at all that a year later, with the Japanese already beginning to think about how naval aviation could level the playing field in the Pacific between the US Pacific Fleet and the Japanese fleet in the outcome of the early days of their invasion of the East Asian mainland, but also eliminating the potential for the US Navy to interdict their operational planning. It should have been a surprise to us at all that Pearl Harbor in 1941 was a direct lineal descendant of the success of the Battle of Taranto. And I would simply also add that we were very lucky that day on the 7th of December that our two carriers were actually out at sea on an exercise. And had they been in port at that particular moment and had been attacked along with the battleship line, the Pacific War might have unfolded in a very different way. We would certainly have prevailed over time. The arsenal of democracy would have done that. But those two carriers and the naval officers who understood the inherent relationship of naval aviation with carrier warfare, they rose in prominence and ultimately would tip the scale in the favor of the United States, because those officers understood that that technology was key now, and they established the equilibrium between the nature and the character of war going forward. Slide, please. So what does hyperwar look like? Let me turn it over to my colleague, Amir, and he'll take us through some of the technical and scientific dimensions of it.
Well, thank you very much, General Allen. Thank you, Michael, Nicole, and Mariah for your kind invitation and your generous introductions. It really is an honor to be with all of you at the National Defense University, and I hope one day soon we'll be able to meet in person. As General Allen has said, we've been thinking about the implications of AI in the field of battle now for many years. And the implications are truly all-encompassing. A lot of people think about this in terms of an autonomous system, a UGV, a UCV, etc., but they're all-encompassing, and they're far-reaching. They apply to strategy, they apply to operations and tactics, and frankly, they apply to the interplay of domains, from deep space to deep sea to the deepest depths of the human mind. Today, in the brief time that we have together, what I want to do is to really focus on the practical vignettes. What I'm interested in above all else is building. And indeed, what's different about what General Allen and I are doing and have been doing is that we aren't merely writing and merely speaking, we're also designing, and we're also transforming those designs into real things in the real world. And you have hypotheses about these things, and then you either prove them or you fail and you move on. And that to me is important. That iteration, that invention, and making something real is important. So here I just want to share a few slivers from that body of work to give you some ideas on what types of innovation is possible by us and frankly by our opponents. So let's start with just some of the large-scale implications. First of all, I believe that operational efficiency, availability, logistics, This is an area which AI will impact in huge ways. There's some work that's already going on. DIUX has been involved in some of this work, but this is all very nascent. Actually, some of the projects that I've been involved with, what I realize more than anything else is that we're just at the very beginning. Sensor data is an assumption, yet many of our platforms don't yet have sensor data. So you apply more complex techniques like natural language processing to try and extract information from work orders that go all the way back to the late 70s for some of our aviation platforms and some of our naval platforms. But there's a lot more potential in being able to deliver AI solutions for operational readiness. And this will make all the difference. Just looking at this more broadly from a global perspective, advanced technology, the software, that enables deep learning at some level, IoT capabilities, things that allow you to think at the edge. This technology is proliferating. So our ability to control these things is frankly, any strategy that is based off of that assumption is a non-starter. The way that you have to think about this is like a startup does, which is move faster. Don't complain about people copying you. Move faster. And that's really where the competitive differentiation comes from. Winners will balance two things. They'll balance the competitiveness of their technologies, and they'll balance that with cost. I was at the Dubai Air Show just a few days ago, and I have to tell you, I wrote a piece about that in Forbes in depth. But from what I see and the innovation that's coming out from all parts of the world, cost is about to become a huge problem for us. We have to resolve this issue, and this actually gets me to number 3, which is our fixation on platforms. Historically understood, we understand why platforms were important. Platforms are going to be less important going forward. And legacy systems combined with AI capabilities are going to give rise to capability and capacity that we haven't imagined. So the innovative nature of combining these new AI-powered decision-making, targeting, sensor fusion, language generation, language understanding capabilities with legacy platforms and capabilities, very, very important. What I'm seeing is that unmanned systems, really, whether they're on the sea, under the sea, on the ground, in the air, this is where the industry's future innovation is all focused. And you've seen how terribly successful these systems have been. In Karabakh, you've seen Libya, you've seen the cargo drone being deployed in Libya in completely autonomous mode. This is the future. This is going to happen. And I came across a couple of pieces that have been written recently on the role of armor. General Allen was talking earlier about blitzkrieg and radios and high-speed maneuver warfare with armored columns. And these articles now are talking about whether tanks need to be kept in the back, and whether this whole idea of a strike corps is no longer a valid conceptualization. The armored corps as being sort of leading the battle is no longer a valid conceptualization, because you'll have to deal with drones first. And how do you deal with drones first? So it's causing a rethink, and it's shaking things up. And then finally, there's new partnerships of all types. The US has to be extremely flexible in the age of hyperwar, in the age of AI. It's not just about military capability, it's about economic partnerships, which form the basis, which provide the strata on top of which military differentiation is built. And if you look at some of the work that's happening now, the UAE just this morning announced that they might be partnering with Russia in the development of the next 5th generation checkpoint fighter. The Turks and the Ukrainians are collaborating on so much in autonomy. The Russians and the Indians on hypersonics, the BrahMos missile. China and Pakistan on the JF-17 fighter. Innovation is coming out from everywhere. And it's no longer really in our benefit to point at each one of these things and say, oh, that's copied, and oh, they took that from us. It is what it is. And what matters is speed, and what matters is what we do. So let's talk about what we can do. So let me show you a vignette as to what one, sort of environment might look like with artificial intelligence everywhere. So on the left here, you have C2 in data visualization, what's now called JAD-C2. JAD-C2 needs to be powered by AI. JAD-C2 fundamentally is a data fusion and an operational awareness system, but it must have AI-powered fusion capabilities so that you can take not multiple sensors of the same type, i.e. 5 radars, but where you can combine radar with sonar, with IR, with visual, with natural language text-based reports, human, and fuse all of that using artificial intelligence. And then on top of that, where you're not just talking about a state of play, but you're talking about a projected state of play. What I wrote in Prism talks about these simulations into the future. This is really one area where artificial intelligence can change the game by giving you alternate vignettes associating probabilities with multiple futures and enabling our commanders to make decisions in that context. So the conceptualization of JAD-C2 will be a lot more as more AI gets integrated into the system. Then we're talking about deployed AI models at the edge, where disconnected operations, denied communications, electronic warfare, these models will be immune to that because they are making decisions at the edge. We're talking about distributed buoyant sensors, the next generation of buoys, if you will. And by the way, think about something. If you just conceptualize the following, a large number of survivable, inexpensive sensors all over the ocean that can communicate, where we can fuse data from these sensors. And by fusing this data, we can triangulate using AI deep learning models. We can pick up signal where traditional techniques couldn't. What does that do to the triad? What does that do to the roughly 70-year long assumption that the most secure element of the triad is the submarine force? Are oceans going to become, far more transparent than they've ever been as this technology proliferates? These are the deep questions that even tactical advancements in AI and sensor fusion force us to consider. And I can talk a lot more about all of this, but I'll leave the picture here for you. High endurance, long-term autonomy. This is another concept. In Austin, we are doing experiments at our HyperWorks facility where we are collaborating with universities like UT Austin in figuring out what long-term autonomy looks like. Can you leave a robot in the wild for days and weeks? And what does that mean? Can you leave a boat on the open seas for days and weeks? And what does that look like? That causes you, and it forces you to build more general purpose systems. So these are the types of things that the future holds. I'll give you, again, one small example. From that big picture, let me just zoom in. Many of you may be familiar with COF, correlation of forces calculations. The way it's done now, if it's done programmatically, is something like what you see those, Microsoft Excel pictures on the left. What those pictures are is, correlation of forces, asset by asset, some kind of weight value associated with what that asset can deliver in terms of its capability and in terms of its firepower. You do the same assessment for the enemy, and you figure out whether in an area the correlation of forces advantages you or disadvantages you for a particular type of maneuver, a particular type of action. But what we're really talking about in the age of AI is imagery in real time being brought in from drones and satellites and assets being identified by computer vision dynamically, probabilistic implications being used to derive what is likely the correlation of forces in a particular area, looking at past records from those same sensors to imply what availability on enemy systems is, what platform availability is, scanning through tons of text reports that say what the enemy has in terms of effects, and what is the replenishment rate of those effects. And therefore, in the current action, given what's been observed, what is the enemy likely to be able to bring to bear where it matters? And the whole idea of correlation of forces goes from guessing games of a number between 0 and 1 to real-time intel-based massive perception nets that derive, imply, and provide statistical bounds for what they're suggesting. And so the decision making gets automated in so many different ways. JADC2++, where earlier I was talking about the use of artificial intelligence, not just to visualize and sensor fuse, but also to project into the future. This is a tool, but somebody needs to build this tool. Now we're looking at how that's possible. There's a lot of individual AI systems that all sort of have to fit in to make this work. But these are the types of things that in the background silently change the game, right? This is before a shot is fired, you have a plan which is so much better and is so adaptive compared to anything that we've had before. And just a word on sensor fusion. Let me give you an example. You have a boat coming towards you. It's a small boat. It's a motor boat, and it could be anything. But an acoustic sensor picks up a vibration pattern, and that acoustic sensor then goes through a machine learning algorithm, and it turns out that you were able to identify the specific brand of motor that's being used on that motorboat. Another AI agent, through the use of NLP, goes and reads through text around arms shipments. And it turns out that that particular, let's say, Caterpillar engine that's being used in this boat was exported to Iran. I'm just making this example up. So that NLP capability says that Iran is in possession of this particular Caterpillar engine. And now you have an acoustic sensor that says, okay, this boat has a Caterpillar engine. Now visual intelligence, visual models confirm other elements of what you would expect in, let's say, the lead element of a swarm. And through the fusion of vision, language, and acoustics, i.e. vibration, you're able to make a determination that this is not a Somali pirate, this is not somebody on a leisure cruise, this might be the lead element of a swarm. And so those types of things represent sensor fusion applications across multiple types of sensors, right? This goes beyond what is typically done now, all automated, all autonomous. You can project this as AR. We've built systems that take all of this data and not only project it in AR, but can enable dialogue. You can speak to them and ask them questions. Why? Because AI, natural language processing. You can interrogate these systems and you can go deeper very quickly in developing an understanding of what the sensors are telling you. Reasoning and planning. Correlation of forces calculators reinvented for the age of AI. That's one element. But strategy generation algorithms using genetic techniques, being able to create trees of possible actions, evaluating those actions, again, based on real-time intelligence, tying those back to correlation of forces predicted into the future, these strategy trees, and using AI approaches, pruning those trees, figuring out what are possible likely scenarios that lead to various different outcomes. Again, this is an entire curriculum. Just this alone, the application of various different AI techniques to reasoning and planning. The reason why I'm giving you these highlights is to say that if you look at the common discussion on AI in the field of battle, one, killer robots good, killer robots bad. Okay, got that. Next. Next thing is, okay, well, the plane flies itself. What kind of plane? Typically a small, close air support, that sort of an aircraft. And then maybe, a smaller drone, a copter, cargo-like, where you do some target recognition using some visual aids. Okay, that's what you hear. Or maybe the Uran 9 UGV that the Russians are testing. That's what you hear. This is not, if on a journey from 1 to 100, this is 0.03. What lies ahead is 97 point whatever 97. And what I'm trying to share here is that areas which are meta reasoning and planning, where before you even get to the tactics, there have been very few things said and written and built around those. And in the interest of time, I'll just very quickly touch upon things here, which again shows a different level of fusion. Everything from geospatial intel, what the NGA produces, being able to again bring vision, which they do, combined with language, and then distributed sensors of all types, subsurface sensors, aerial sensors, fusion, and bringing that to the commander, again, through newer aids, AR, VR, and other high impact visualization mechanisms. So again, as I mentioned to you, we're not interested in just talking about this, and we're not interested in slideware alone. What we are interested in is proving these concepts out. So General Allen and myself share at least these, actually there's half a dozen patents that have come through that have been awarded. These represent our ideas on how some of these AI systems can be used together. As an example, just one example, being able to take an autonomous USV or a UUV and to have it patrol outside of a CSG's perimeter, and then to be able to deploy UAVs from within itself, all working on a swarm algorithm that basically act like autonomous, intelligent, adaptive barrage balloons to defend against cruise missile strikes that are skimming the surface of the sea and are coming in at predicted areas. And you have literally this vessel pops up. You have now these are not tremendously expensive. This is not an aircraft carrier. This is a small scale, relatively inexpensive system where much of the action and much of the differentiation is the software, is the AI. And this is just one small example of what's possible. These types of systems, when you start thinking about the theory of how you deploy them and what effects they create and what they change and what assumptions they alter, the investments that we make, for example, in protecting a carrier, how do those change when you have these lightweight systems with AI at the edge protecting those carriers instead? There's a lot to think about here. And another way in which we're trying to contribute is I'm lucky enough to serve on the NATO Unmanned Systems Advisory Board, where we have conceived of a system called Digital Ocean. So earlier when I was talking about sensors all over the place, being able to pick up signal, being able to use deep nets to fuse all of that information and create pictures that have not been created before in their accuracy and in the real-time nature of that information extraction. This is exactly what we're trying to do with our Digital Ocean project. And there's a lot of material available on it online. There's a short little film that talks about how NATO conceives Digital Ocean. But these are real projects where us, the United States, along with our partners, are beginning to see the deeper applications of AI. And this is where our differentiation will be built, not on the surface, not on the 0.03 where we're at right now, but in the 97 and more, the 99 and more that awaits us. I'll give you one other small example. Drones, as you know, are flying computers in the sky with network connections. And you have this RQ-170 story in front of you. You know what happened there, whether the Iranians did this themselves or whether they had help from the Russians, it doesn't really matter. What matters is there is an RQ-170 that was landed using electronic means and has now been replicated. So what do you do in situations like this? Well, we have actually, earlier this year, we launched the first flight on record ever of an autonomous drone protected with totally autonomous cybersecurity capability. So even if the system is disconnected, it has no connectivity with the ground controller, it's capable of autonomously detecting and thwarting cyber attacks at the edge. This type of capability needs to be everywhere. Otherwise, you'll have a cyber strike maybe run by people, maybe run by AI in the future, that will be able to transform an inbound into an outbound, where you'll be able to take control of other people's assets and turn them around. And so we were able to demonstrate that the drone in flight, armed with this capability, with the cyber detection and response capability, we launched an attack from the ground. The drone identified it, classified it as an attack, took appropriate measures, and blocked the attack. So that, and of course, this is something that we'll have to continue to invest in, because there'll be ways of getting around this, and then there's a counter, and then there's another. But the point is, this whole avenue, this whole vector of being able to launch cyber strikes against autonomous assets, this is a whole new class of system that needs to be explored and countered. So, in summary, I'll just tell you that, it's just been an absolute delight and one of the richest experiences of my life, collaborating with General Allen in all of these areas. If you can't tell, we've been having a lot of fun, and I think we've been doing one or two things of some level of interest to at least a few people. And it's different backgrounds, completely different ways of looking at the picture, but the conclusion that we've arrived at is the same conclusion. And the passion with which both of us feel the need to do something, to act, to build, to show, to demonstrate is shared. So with that, let me just stop. I think it's best to get into a discussion and debate. And let me again thank you. It's a great honor to be here with you, and certainly a great honor to be with my friend, General Allen, addressing you today.
Thank you both for a very kind of disconcerting presentation, and I think that's probably appropriate under the circumstances. We have quite a few questions, and let me just ask you for your forbearance in advance. Really provocative presentations like this generate compound questions, so some of the questions are fairly involved. I'm going to begin with one from my colleague here at the College of Information and Cybersecurity, James Cherbuck, who asks, how does the military gain support for lethal autonomous weapon systems as a desirable element of US military power? Our enemies, our adversaries rather, have no need for popular support. But as a former arms control staff officer, I see significant opposition to lethal autonomous weapon systems by organizations like this Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. So how do we overcome that opposition and make lethal autonomous weapon systems part of our toolbox?
Why don't I start, and Amir, you can come in. Well, it's a great question. It's a question that's asked all the time. And at this juncture, the US government's been very clear that it does not intend to have fully autonomous lethal weapon systems. The challenge and the debate that is underway right now, not just in the United States, but more broadly, but in the United States, certainly in the US military, is how do we ultimately retain the human dimension of the control of these systems, so that we don't have fully autonomous lethal weapon systems laws making individual decisions to take human life or to destroy critical infrastructure. And this is an ongoing debate. It is not one that is, I think, in the near term going to be resolved. But the question is very important, because as Amir and I have attempted to convey, so much of what advantages the one side or the other in the context of hyperwar is the capacity to move more quickly than your opponent. And when your opponent is operating fully autonomous, lethal autonomous weapon systems laws, when they're operating systems where there's no human in the loop in any way, shape, or form, theoretically, they have the capacity to deliver lethal or destructive capabilities more quickly than we can. But for now, within our own military and within our own government, and more broadly in the community of democracies, the issue of lethal autonomous systems is one that is under significant debate. And the question becomes, where is the human in the loop? Is the human in the loop? In other words, the system detects the target, identifies the target, is ready to engage the target, but the trigger pull on the platform does not occur without a human clearing that decision to be made. That's a human in the loop or a human on the loop, which is that whole process unfolds. The human sees that this is unfolding in a way that delivers the effects that we would want in the battle space, and then does not intervene. So you have in the loop, on the loop. When brain-computer interface becomes more advanced, we may find another version of this as well. But this is a major issue of debate, because we have no reason to expect among our peer competitors that they'll be so limited in their thinking on this matter. And we certainly know that there are elements in the world today that we may ultimately go into a conflict environment with, where they'll be employing lethal autonomous weapon systems against us from the very beginning of the conflict. So this is an area of debate for us, and it's the kind of debate we would want to have as a people who are committed to human rights and the rule of law. But it's not over for us, but for now, this is the nature of the debate. Let me ask Amir if he'd like to comment.
Very sure. I completely concur. I look at this with a game theoretic lens, which is that the developments in AI are not verifiable, like, for example, the presence of a nuclear reactor is verifiable in a country. And therefore, you can have a small number of people in a basement somewhere with code that never shows up until it shows up in a physical system. So the working assumption that most countries have, no matter what is said, but rationality dictates this. The assumption that most countries have is that the other guy is working on it. And if that's the assumption that you have, then the Nash equilibrium, again, per game theory, is everybody develops it. And so what do you see now? The South Koreans developing them, the Turks fielding them, the Israelis fielding and deploying and developing them, and Russia and China. So I think, look, the goal of having peace on earth and no war and all of this, who would disagree with any of those things? But autonomous systems are a technology of war, unfortunately, and other people are developing them. I think what we need to aim for is deterrence, period. That's what my view is on this topic.
One other point I'll make is there is a conversation about the upstream testing of the algorithms themselves and the coding, to give us a high level of confidence that if released for autonomous engagement, that those systems will act exactly the way we want to. But that becomes very, very difficult and early in that conversation about explainable AI and reliable AI. We're not there yet. We're not there yet. But it is possible for countries to produce those and to deliver them into the battle space to become a factor when we're dealing with them as well. But we have a human in the loop. We're forced to because of the way we do business in conflict.
Thank you both for your answers to that very tough question. I would just comment that it's good from my point of view to see that we do have this debate in this country. In other countries, the debate is not a public debate at all, but here we do. This question is from Paul Glover from the Defense Science and Technology Laboratory in the UK. Could there be a risk of misperceiving a situation such that own strength used in committing to rapid action could be turned against the one who commits first upon its misperception?
I'm not sure I follow the question. Amir, if you'd like to start, I'll try to come in.
If the implication there is misperception, i.e. AI misperceiving reality by being fooled, or adversarial approaches working against it. In many ways, I mean, that is one of the risks in war in any case. What are decoys? What are inflatable decoys of both armor and aircraft? And how many stories can we tell of how they were successfully deployed to fool human perception in adversarial environments? AI faces the same risk, but I think that by understanding and being able to test and being able to develop adversarial systems and being able to toughen and harden AI perception capabilities, and in addition, to have completely different AI systems that perceive the same thing and using many elements from distributed systems theory, create voting structures that allow a greater level of surety, if you will, about the implications being drawn. I think you can do better, right? So it becomes an engineering problem. A lot of times people ask questions of the type, but wouldn't a machine be fooled by this? And almost in each one of those conceptions, you can turn around and ask the question, but wouldn't a person be fooled by this? And the issue is now not so much whether the quantum of being fooled is larger for the machine or for the person. What we know is that people are generally still fooled by the same things that they were fooled by 5,000 years ago. But I guarantee you, in 5,000 years, machines will be fooled by a lot less than they're fooled by now. So the question is, where is the chance for exponential improvement? And this type of argument as a means to stop progress is something that I don't understand. I'm not suggesting at all that the gentleman asking the question is implying that. What I'm saying is that this issue of, but won't AI fail in this situation? Maybe. Won't humans fail in this situation? Probably. And here's 1,800 examples from history when humans failed in exactly this situation.
And I'll just come in as well. I think one of the realities that we will see will be as AI does the analysis of whatever the intelligence inputs might be, we will see its capacity to express anomalous behavior as well with respect to the data. So it not only has the capacity to do prediction, but it also has the capacity to give you a sense, given the entirety of the input, its confidence, its own confidence on how the behavior that it has observed, it has done the analysis on, it has done the prediction on, whether what level of confidence that is, given the anomalous behavior that it has detected. And I think that that will be something that we will see, so that you get a prediction of some form or another, and it gives you a level of confidence that there is no anomalous behavior in here that could in fact be a spoofing or the result of conscious deception by the opponent.
Seems to be a theme emerging from the questions, and that is, how do we manage the risk of artificial intelligence? And this question from Amy Nelson at the Brookings Institution is in that same direction. She prefaces her question by saying that when we've turned to international law and global governance historically to place restrictions on the use of weapons during wartime, we've adopted numerical constraints and bans on whole categories of weapons. How do we do something similar in the temporal dimension? Will we be able to constrain, regulate, or ban conflict in weapons that function at a pace that exceeds human cognitive capacity?
Amy's got a great question. I actually know this questioner, and I'm not at all surprised that this question came. Remembering that we're trying to make a distinction here between the application of autonomous weapon systems and the role of AI in intelligence or command and control. And while we still have the capacity, I think, to develop weapon systems that can be fully autonomous, and we have to figure out the moral dimension of that, I don't think that we will see a reluctance, and I don't know if I'm getting to Amy's question here, but a reluctance on the part of the United States and its allies to develop artificial intelligence that provides for the maximum capacity to accelerate decision assistance or decision support, or the maximum capacity for wide area ingestion of intelligence data of all the various media that Amir talked about: space, air, subsurface, HUMANT, all of those ints coming in simultaneously. And I think we will see, as much as we possibly can, the application of artificial intelligence in those areas as we continue probably to build the capacity for the unleashing of lethal autonomous systems, while we worry about the moral dimension of it. So I don't see this slowing down at all. The question, I think, becomes less about the application of individual weapon systems than it is, if I understand Amy's question correctly, are we going to try to move into an area where we limit those kinds of systems in order to limit their effect in the context of the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. I think it's an open debate. It's one that we have to be engaged in as we go forward. One of the things that I'm increasingly concerned about, and Mike, you and I briefly talked about this before we started, is the distance between the private sector and the public sector, and the distance between the scientific community and the weapons procurement and the systems procurement community. And frankly, how long it takes for us to move from concept to employment is in and of itself a strategic vulnerability as we go forward. And the United States has absolutely exquisite and perfect legal and ethical systems and processes engaged by going from that governs moving from a concept ultimately to buying a system and employing it. But we take too long. And as we move that process to be closer and closer between the private sector and the public sector, to shorten the distance from the concept to the employment, that I think is going to certainly create the capacity for us to move more quickly at a strategic level, to produce greater effects at the tactical level. But I also worry, frankly, that we're going to see a gap open between the United States and our allies in ways that we've never seen before. This has always been something that has worried me. Amir, perhaps in his seat, he sits in that seat, and I'm so glad to hear that he's working with NATO on these issues. This has been an issue for us as we've talked about the future of NATO, and as the United States continues to embrace these emerging technologies and to embed artificial intelligence in so many of the processes and capabilities that provide for intelligence and command and control, and ultimately target detection of right up to the point of engagement. We're one of the few countries that has that capacity for innovation, period. And we're also one of the few countries that has the industrial base, the research base, to be able to move those concepts to fruition and acquisition and ultimately employment. And as we move more quickly in that process, the gap will open between us and our allies. And I worry about that as well in the context of NATO being an interoperable alliance. We haven't been truly interoperable for a very long time, but this gap is going to create even greater differences between our operational capabilities as we go forward. And
this question is, I'm going to privilege another of my NDU colleagues, Rob Richardson, who is at NDU as the Defense Intelligence Systems Agency chair, who asks a hyperwar question. Hyperwar evolution question. Your remarks indicate that the evolution of hyperwar will progress along the OODA steps, from observe to orient to decision aid to finally decide and act. So how long will that evolution take? A decade, a generation, or longer?
It's already happening. And I think it's not just a sort of step-by-step linear progression. If you think about observe, perception AIs of all types have been fielded, and they're quite successful. They're being used today. The orientation and the decision, the planning functions, very nascent, but starting some progress there. And in terms of action, these are individual autonomous systems that you might say that action is tactical. Actually, in our book, Hyperwar, which General Allen, myself, and Secretary Bob Work all collaborated on, there's a autonomy spectrum, a diagram that shows through tactical, operational, and strategic some examples of where systems are already being built or what future systems would look like to fill each one of those buckets across that spectrum. But short of a very long discussion on this topic, what I would tell you is it's already happening. And I don't think there's one moment in time in a decade or in 15 years. I think what you're seeing is that there are autonomous systems of limited reach today that are offensive. I gave the cargo drone as an example that's been used in Libya and probably was used in Karabakh as well, where the drone at the edge identified the target, went in for the target, and carried out the kinetic action. A larger version of that drone is not an AI problem. It's a metal bending problem. That's an easily solved problem.
Right.
So the question here is, there's going to be advancements in all of these areas all at the same time. And at some point, as you're mixing these two colors, the new color emerges, But what exact point that'll be, it's a few years. I mean, I don't think it's tomorrow, but at the same time, dimensions of that future are available today.
Any further comment on that, General Allen?
No, I would just say that if you go back to the points I was trying to make, the OODA loop is a very simplified way of looking at it, but it's a useful intellectual construct to understand once again that the capacity to move from the operational environment through the decision and action has been at the heart of military success, from the very beginning. And as technology continues to increase and to improve, the capacity for us to move even more quickly is the outcome that we're seeking. And one of the things that we know, for those who've studied maneuver warfare, where the effectiveness of maneuver warfare could have been measured theoretically in destructive outcomes, the greatest effect from the application of maneuver warfare, which is intellectually quite difficult. You really have to be a student of the profession of arms to understand the full advantage of this. When married properly with technological capability, the effect long before you have defeated the enemy in a kinetic way is that you have collapsed the command and control and the moral capacity of the opposing side, and potentially even that opposing country to remain in the game, because you're able to move more quickly, more dynamically. Then the other side is able to perceive your movements, to react to your movements, and to ultimately respond to your movements. And that speed with which all of this is giving us has a moral dimension to it, which in warfare has almost always defined in some form or another, ultimately, the outcome of defeat for one side or the other. So it's not just about kinetic outcomes. It's not just about destructive outcomes. It's by moving this fast compared to the opponent, in intelligent ways through artificial intelligence and the application of fires, or the applications of effects in multi-domain environments and cross-domain environments, that gives us the capacity, frankly, to fold up the enemy's moral capacity to wage war. And that's what we're looking for here. And as Amir said, it's already beginning to happen. And I don't think we're going to arrive at a point where we'll say, aha, we're in hyperwar now. This is a description, frankly, of an environment where the human, or the nature and the character of war, have become so fused, and the nature of the character of the technology have become so advanced that the speed of conflict now reaches hyper speeds compared to the traditional speed of conflict, and we're beginning to see that already.
Here's a question from Chris Bauman. All of this connectivity is dependent on the electromagnetic spectrum, which is a very limited resource. Are there technical advances coming that will enable greater transmission volume and rates?
This gives me an opportunity to share something which blew my mind. We were working on a reinforcement learning problem. Reinforcement learning is an area within artificial intelligence which seeks to create optimal policies for action. So how optimally should a robot or 10 robots or multiple systems act in any given situation? And in this particular scenario, we were training up multiple ship formations of fighter aircraft that were then launched into simulated combat with a Red Force, and they were supposed to interact with each other. One of the capabilities in the simulator was to turn on Red Force electronic warfare capabilities that resulted in the spectrum being jammed and the Blue Force being unable to collaborate and to communicate with each other. What we found that the reinforcement learning policies evolved in a way which essentially made these aircraft, the best description I can give you on a non-technical basis is that it made the Blue Force aircraft act like acrobats in a circus. Where acrobats, they'll propel themselves off of one pole and they'll be, doing a maneuver in the air, and magically at the other end, there's somebody else that's there to receive them, and what is there's the width of the palm of your hand is basically the target, right? And with so much physics going on dynamically, it's just amazing that happens. How does that happen? It's not verbal communication. What it is it's training together, and there's almost a sixth sense of anticipation that's built up between people that train together. So these biological neural networks, our brains have the ability to do that, to develop that sixth sense of anticipation. And in this environment, we found that even though we cut off communications between members of the Blue Force, they were acting as if they would basically, if they could communicate. And that coordination was coming from millions of simulated exercises within a simulated environment that had caused reinforcement learning policies to be optimized for this particular mission, which was defensive counter air. It blew my mind because this was communication-free coordination. I'm not saying this will work in every circumstance, but the fact that it emerged unexpectedly in an experiment like this blew my mind.
Sounds like one of those flow charts where in the middle there's a bubble that says, "And here a miracle happened." In any case, a question from Anthony Garland. Machine learning and artificial intelligence are very much dual-use technologies. As a result, the leaders in artificial intelligence seem to be tech companies such as Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, and Apple. How do we enable industry to continue making advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence for commercial use, but also best leverage the advances for military applications? Back to the how do we create the incentives for them to work collaboratively with the national security community?
Well, I think it depends on the company, and they are slightly different in their orientation with respect to working with defense. But in many respects, the Chinese aren't competing with the U.S. government in this arena. They're competing with the private sector of the United States. And increasingly, what we're seeing is DoD is working more closely with these organizations to ensure that the innovation that is spinning off can serve the interests of our defense requirements, not just the U.S., but our allies as well as best we can. But they are dual-use technologies, and I don't see that changing. Where we, I think, are headed, obviously, is to an environment of regulatory action that is as yet not fully understood or unknown at this point. Regulatory activity typically lags technological innovation, sometimes by years, as much as 7 years at a time has been the lag. But what we're going to see, I think, particularly in the United States, although the Europeans are broadly, I think, ahead of us in this regard, especially the EU, will be that the regulatory dimension that will be levied with the private sector, we would hope would continue to still stimulate innovation at the same time that it creates the protections for our population, but also creates incentives for the private sector to work with the Department of Defense and other entities to harvest the benefits of those dual-use technologies. One of the other concerns that I spend a lot of my time on these days is the role of these emerging technologies and artificial intelligence by authoritarian states, autocrats, liberals, by transnational criminal networks, by certain terrorist organizations. And to Amir's point, the price of these algorithms and the capacity through the Internet of Things to exploit open societies, ultimately to damage confidence in democratic processes and democracy writ large. Right now, this is a major issue for us. We've just talked for most of this period of time about lethal autonomous weapon systems or how artificial intelligence improves command and control and intelligence. But the reality is, of course, our democracy and the democracy of many of the countries around the world is under direct assault right this minute by the Russians and the Chinese and others who are employing these technological capabilities through for strategic influence operations and using micro-tactical targeting capabilities through artificial intelligence to erode confidence in our societies for our very system of government and to divide us as people along religious or ethnic or racial lines. And so when we talk about whether a Hellfire missile is going to come off the rails of a drone and take life and have that debate about the employment of lethal autonomous weapon systems, right now, our whole system of government. And our free and open society is under direct assault, using these same kinds of technologies to erode the efficacy and the cohesion of democracy going forward. And that's an area that, frankly, I spend a lot of my time on, more now than about the issues associated with the applications of these technologies for overt military purposes. But we have to have the big picture here. And the big picture is these technologies are being wielded against us right this minute. And we as open societies, we're still in the debate about how we'll respond. Are we going to control social media? These dual use technologies, are we going to regulate them in a way that they can't be ever used against the population? And what does that do to innovation? And can we continue to spiral upward in the innovation necessary to bring these technologies to bear for the good of all humankind? These are big questions, and they're big challenges for us right now. And those are challenges we're facing today.
Thank you, sir. Amir, as a representative of the private sector, do you think that the gap between the private sector and the national security community is an ideological gap, or is it more a question of the cumbersomeness of working with the U.S. government versus how quick it is to work within the private sector?
Well, I have very strong feelings about this, and also experience that goes back many, many years. One of the things that I'll tell you is I was at the Pentagon, and I think I was with General Allen. There was a briefing going on, and somebody asked me, how do you rate threats to the US, to our competitiveness? And I said, well, number 3 is probably Russia, number 2 is China. And the gentleman said, well, number 2 is China, who's number 1? And I said, probably acquisitions. In my view, the biggest source of innovation that we have in this country is young companies that come up with incredible innovations that ultimately may get acquired by one of the big tech companies. But just look at how many small companies the larger tech companies acquire. A lot of the innovation and growth comes from these emerging companies. So why can't the DoD directly tap into that fount of American ingenuity? And the answer to that question is because it's essentially it's disastrous for a young company to go down the path as it exists today. The amount of time, the expectations are so 1973 that it's unbelievable. And no, current startup that with the exception of a few that have been lucky to raise a lot of capital, can engage in this way. So we've been lucky in that regard, but in my view, I don't want to just sort of sit on that luck and say, okay, we were able to power through and wait years and years, and then something good came of it. What about everyone else? Because there's a lot of innovation across a lot of areas. So I think acquisition, we talk about it a lot. It's just not there yet. I mean, it's very complex. The other thing I'll say about, commercial use of AI and leveraging it for both. The other debate that's been happening in the US over the last few years is whether we should ban AI on exports and prevent our companies from shipping AI products because they're dual use and require onerous certifications and I don't think so, actually. Every time we've tried that, we failed. Right after 9/11 and the beginning of the Iraq War, several Middle Eastern countries came to us and said, we'd like to use these tactical drones that you guys are using. And we said, no, 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 and no. And all 5 or 6 countries that we said no to within years were using Chinese drones. In the age of AI, the data that you generate off of these platforms is also valuable. The experience, the tuning in these early stages is also valuable. So we lost that opportunity. And the Chinese systems have improved, as you would expect them to, with this additional engagement. How do you get good at playing tennis? Not by avoiding your number 1 rival, but by playing more and more with them. Our approach seems to be that I've got some secret, move that nobody else will be able to discern. And in too many situations, our answer is don't engage, don't share, don't say, don't put out some technology to create a partnership. I don't think that's helpful. What do we do with AI? We engage the world. We go and engage the world, and we create partnerships, and we create systems that are shared between us and our partners. And where we don't have very strong partnerships, we use technology to enhance those partnerships. We broaden that set of relationships. And finally, what we do is we move fast. Because if we think that our competitive differentiation lies in our ability to keep secrets for a long period of time in the age of social networks and in the age of instant information transfer from one end of the world to the other, we're mistaken. That's not where our differentiation lies.
Thank you
Let me
very
make
much.
one other quick comment, and that is where we have seen the Chinese in development activities in the developing world, where they have either installed or ultimately overwritten the information technology backbones or the infrastructure in those countries. Invariably, what you'll see is their unlimited access to the data, and often the packages that they sell in the development acquisition or the development activities carries with it very heavy surveillance capabilities and the capacity ultimately for the individuals who are dealing with the Chinese to have Chinese infrastructure backbones, and extensive surveillance capabilities at the high end of the way the Chinese use artificial intelligence and data manipulation to surveil and oppress their societies. That goes to the point that Amir has made. If we're not willing to offer those kinds of capabilities to countries to facilitate a proto-democracies movement into the democratic world, somebody else with what they believe to be a superior model of governance and somebody else with technology they're willing to share, they will do it. And they're doing it now. And increasingly, it makes it more difficult for those countries ultimately to find their way apart from the Chinese moving forward, or to find themselves into a relationship with us as we go forward. And it's a challenge.
Thank you both. Gentlemen, we're nearly out of time. I just want to ask one final question, and then I'm going to turn over the floor to Lieutenant General Michael Plain, the president of National Defense University, who wants to make a few remarks before we adjourn. The former Air Force and Space Force Chief Software Officer, Nicholas Chalain, says we've already lost the AI competition, and he rather flamboyantly resigned. So in this three-way competition between the United States, China, and Russia, who's winning in the AI competition?
My view is China is winning. And 5 years ago, 4.5 years ago, I was at the center of a new American security. There was a big discussion on when we all thought that, China would overtake the US. And the estimate at that time was 5 years. Eric Schmidt, I asked the question to Eric Schmidt, and Eric Schmidt said, yeah, I agree. I think it's going to be 5 years. We're 4.5 years into it. Either we're keeping everything we're doing in the space entirely secret, or the Chinese are ahead. That's about my assessment.
General Allen, do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I typically agree with everything that Amir says. I don't think we know precisely right now. What we do know is that the Chinese intention and ambition and aspiration is that they will surpass us. They're putting the resources against it. It's a national objective. Xi Jinping has been very clear from the 19th Party Congress on that the Chinese will eclipse the United States in our AI and scientific innovation. And if we wanted to get into the issues of the stack, the technology stack in terms of the design, the manufacture, the application, the regulatory pieces, in some areas I think we are ahead, but in some areas the Chinese are very clearly ahead. And it is their ambition to outstrip us in terms of artificial intelligence going forward. Again, they have the strategic longevity, they have the resources to put against it, they have the closed engineering capacity to do that. And we are still all over the map in terms of our national expectations and ambitions in that regard.
We had better get to work. Lieutenant General Plain, over to you.
Well, thank you, Michael, and to General Allen and Mr. Husain. Thank you for an incredibly thought-provoking presentation, both your individual presentations and then during the excellent question and answer session. I would tell you that I am a fan of the OODA loop, General Allen, as you probably realize, and you've made me think about it a little bit differently during this presentation. You've made me think about it through the lens of AI, through the lens of autonomy. The observation piece is probably the most obvious. Orientation, what does that start looking like? Does that start looking like perfect match with some list inside of, you know, a program or a data repository, or closest match. When you get to decide and act, you've touched on already the policy issues of how much authority would you delegate to an autonomous system? Would you put a person in or on the loop for the final piece of action? These are just a few of the many questions you provoked in my mind and amongst the audience too, I'm sure. You definitely made me think about Clay Christensen, Innovator's Dilemma, disrupting technology versus sustaining technology. And then finally, Jack Welch's admonition to all of us that when the pace of change outside the organization exceeds the pace of change inside the organization, the end is near, and then it's just a question of when. So how much innovation do we need to do in the short term and the long term to ensure that we at least keep pace with change, but hopefully outpace that change? Wonderful presentation, gentlemen. I thank you. I thank you, Michael, INSS, and the SMA. And back over to you, Michael. Over.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant General Plain. Ladies and gentlemen, there are always more questions than there is time for a discussion. And that's just the nature of these events, which are just really teasers for future longer discussions. And in my selfish opinion, for writing these thoughts out and publishing to improve and enrich the quality of our national debate on these vexing issues. Please join me in thanking our distinguished speakers, General Allen and Mr. Husain, for educating us today. And I always like to thank my partners in the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment, Nicole, Mariah, and Todd Veazey. Of course, I thank NDU leadership for empowering us to succeed, and I thank you all for joining us today. This is Michael McCloudrick from National Defense University. Over and out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.